Hello, welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time. My name is Ashley, and this is of Olive Oil and Honey, where I hope to inspire God's daughters to be of God's Spirit and God's Word. And today's video, I'm actually here to share about my recent mission trip to Cuba. And I know I mentioned it in the first two videos, and so I'm finally back, and I'm excited to share everything that transpired. But first, before we hop into the details, I just wanted to thank everyone for praying for me before the trip and during the trip. They were definitely appreciated so much. And so I was kind of going back and forth, like, God, how do you want me to structure this video? And I think it would help to provide some context if I actually rewind 8 years. And so I went to Cuba actually for the first time back in 2016. And so it was more of a cultural experience. And so for those that don't know, Cuba and the US do not have the best relationship. And so there's some hoops that you have to go through in order to actually go to Cuba as a US citizen. And so you have to pick a specific reason. You can't just say, like, I'm going on vacation. It's not like, a US citizen going to Spain just for the fun of it. And so 8 years ago, my reason was people to people. And so they would take us to some cultural landmarks. We would learn about the history of the country, the spiritual history of the country as well, which I'll kind of get into a little bit later. And so what I love about that trip, though, it was very educational. But our tour guide was amazing. She made sure to actually show us the real about Cuba. So, growing up, we learned a little bit about communism because Cuba is a communist country. And she would take us to places like the hospital. And I just remember walking through, and it was just, granted, it was a maternity ward, like it was specifically for women giving birth. And that's not a fun process at all. But the women, they looked distressed, but it was just the environment, I just imagine, would make it even more of a stressor, because when I think of the hospital, the word abysmal comes to mind. It was awful. It was just in a really bad condition. Like, I wouldn't even want to go to that hospital to get my cut cleaned, to be completely honest. She took us to a pharmacy, and it was wiped clean. Like, there was just barely anything on the shelves. And there was one night in particular, a group of us went out to go salsa dancing. I love to dance salsa. And so we went salsa dancing. There was karaoke. We were coming back, like, so excited, like, oh, that was so fun or whatever. And I can't even remember how we came across this woman, but we just started talking to this woman sitting outside. And that conversation just, I think the Lord was working through that woman. She just didn't know it. I didn't know it at the time, but it planted seeds it was a conversation that I never forgot. And I just remember her telling us, no estoy feliz, like, I'm not happy. She was begging us for soap. I was mid-20s at that time, and so I hadn't really traveled much, and I didn't realize that soap was a luxury. Everyone has soap, right? No, it's not true. And so I regretted to this day that I never went back to my hotel room and brought that woman soap. I think a part of me was like, it was nighttime. I didn't want to go alone, but I could have maybe had someone go walk with me. Keep that in mind. And so that was my first trip, learning about, like, food rationing and how people don't have enough food. But even with, the sadder parts of the effects of communism, I fell in love with the country. And I think that was the Lord doing the work as well. Just because, like, I think it was a mix of the people that I went with. Most of the people I didn't even know. We just met on the trip, but we just all got along so well. I love Cuban food. Like, even before going, I just love Cuban food. So eating the food there, I felt like I was eating food from my mom's kitchen. And just the people are so resilient and genuine. and they just have such a heart. I'm also someone that doesn't like to stand out, and so I love that I can go to Cuba and blend in. That's until, like, I can speak Spanish. I'm not fluent, but until the conversation escalates. And if you know Cuban Spanish, you know it is a very fast language. And so I can speak to someone, and then once they throw me off, they jump into the conversation. That's when they know I'm a fraud. I'm not an actual Cuban. So I love the people. I love the country. And I could not wait to go back. And in the meantime, God was doing a work. And so fast forward 4 years, and I became born again. At the time, I was like a lukewarm Christian. And 2020 is when I became born again officially, I would say. And I knew that God was calling me to the mission field. And so it was just a matter of waiting for him to send me. And so in the last video, I mentioned about my Thailand trip, how leading up to the Thailand trip, how God was speaking to me about Cuba. And so I wanted to share some of those details. And so it was a few weeks before the Thailand trip. I remember one night talking to my mom on the phone, and I think I had read something just randomly, how Cuban parents were trying to instill the faith in their children. And the very next day, I think it was Voice of the Martyrs, either Voice of the Martyrs or Open Doors, had posted something on YouTube that was in my feed. And it was sharing about how parents in Cuba were hoping to instill their faith in their children. I took a screenshot and sent to my mom. I was like, oh my gosh, we were literally just talking about this last night. Crazy. And so then I also had a dream, and this is one of the ways that God speaks to me, is through my dreams. And I didn't really think too much of it until, later. Hindsight is 2020. But there was this dream I had where I was rooting for this girl. Like, she was in a race, a track race, and she was representing Cuba. And I remember just rooting for her, and I was like, oh, that's an interesting dream. And literally on one of the flights going to Thailand, I think it was my flight from the States to Hong Kong, before Hong Kong to Thailand, I happened to see a santera. And a santera is someone that practices Santeria, which we had actually, so the first time I went to Cuba, they took us as a cultural experience to a place where people practice Santeria. I was lukewarm. Please give me grace. I went and was ready to go. It felt very uncomfortable. But I hadn't seen anyone who practiced it since then. And the way you know that someone practices, at least in the first year, for the first year, they wear all white, and they're mostly known for their beads. Like, they tend to be pretty colorful. They wear a white head covering. And so on the flight, I have the dream in mind. I have that post in mind, like the conversations that I've been having with people. And now I'm seeing this lady. I'm like, I have not seen a santera since I was in Cuba. So it's like, oh my gosh. And another thing you should know about Santeria is it's a syncretic religion. So it's a blend of Catholicism and then Western African Yoruba practices. And so they kind of merge it. So like the saints in Catholicism, the people in Yoruba, when the enslaved Africans were brought to Cuba, kind of blended their I think they're called orishas, like their saints, with the Catholic saints. And so they just kind of like married those two practices to appease their slaveholders. And I'm sorry, my dog is he's playing with his squeak toy at this moment. He was not playing with it before I began. So yeah, I saw this lady, and then there was one, I think it was like my second or third night in Cuba. I had talked to my mom on the phone again, and I'm telling her about the lady that I saw on the way to Hong Kong. And I was like, man, I'm really feeling like maybe God wants me to finally go back. And so it was the next day, because only a few of us had arrived in Thailand at that time. We were still waiting for one couple and then a dad and his daughter to arrive. And the next day, we're sitting at the breakfast table, and that's my first time meeting this couple, I think. And we're going around the table, and I don't know if we were like introducing ourselves. And the gentleman goes, yeah, we haven't been on many mission trips, but we have been to Cuba. And I was like, oh my gosh, what? So I like, honestly, it was kind of rude, but I like interrupted him. I was like, what did you just say? And yeah, he clarified that they've been on a mission trip to Cuba in the past, and um, they've been kind of feeling like the Lord maybe wanting them to go back. And I'm like, this is it. Like, I know for a fact that God wants me to go to Cuba at this point. And so, whoops. I think it was that night that I finally, when I was in my hotel bed, I was Googling mission trips to Cuba. I just, if you're not aware, communism tends to adapt or adopt atheism. And so I just wasn't sure if I would be able to find anything with regard to mission trips to Cuba, like online. But I found an organization called Bold Hope, and I was like, I found it was between Bold Hope and another one. The other one seemed kind of sus a little bit, so I just kind of forgot about that one. When I got back to from Thailand to the States, I think it was like a couple days later that I looked it up and I just signed up because I was like, I feel like this is what God wants. And so that was just like a super quick process as far as just joining. And I was so excited. Like, and the cool thing about it is I remember coming back from Thailand, going to church, and people were like, where's next? And I was like, oh my gosh, how did you know? But I think at this point, I just kind of travel quite a bit. And so I think they're just kind of accustomed to me always having somewhere to go. So yeah, so leading up to Cuba, they had given us an agenda. I think it was like a week or so before. And so I kind of had an idea as far as like what we would be doing, but you can never really be too sure, right? Like things just change. It's God's agenda, right? And so I remember I began, I had been thinking of starting this book, actually, I have it right here, Tortured for Christ by Richard Wurmbrand. And I had maybe like a year or so ago watched the movie on Tubi, I think. And it's free on there if you're interested. It's a really good movie. But I had read the first 2 chapters, I think, while I was getting my hair done in preparation for the trip. And I felt like the Lord ordained that because it was like the book was preparing me on mission trips in a communist country. And in the agenda that they had sent us, they had said, a couple of times we would be giving an encouraging word and sharing testimonies. And so I don't like to speak in front of people, it's funny because what am I doing here? I'm on YouTube. And so there was this one chapter in particular where he was sharing about how he's evangelized to so many people, but he's never seen people as thirsty for the gospel as the communist Russians. And he would share different parables that would contrast communist ideology. And there was one in particular, it was the parable of the lost sheep. And as I was reading, I was like, God, this is brilliant. Like, I know for a fact that I should share this story. And I did the first session, and it just because the communist ideology is the collective, right? And so it just kind of goes against the communist perspective of why would you leave 99 for the one? Like, you have the greater amount with the 99, that's the collective. Why would you go out for the one? And so there was that. Let's see, looking at my notes. Let's say, okay, let me fast forward to like the week leading up to the trip. So I read the book. I was like, I definitely want to share that parable. One thing if you go on mission trips, you're probably aware there will be spiritual warfare. And so before Thailand, my car decided not to start. Like sometimes it would start, but it would take a really long time. And I had the push to start. So it took sometimes quite a few times I would have to like sit and wait in parking lots for my car to do whatever. And so that was a very expensive fix. And then like a few days before I left, I was leaving work, heading home, and all of a sudden I hear the sound, and it sounded like my tire popped. So I was like panicking. I was really panicking. And I went to Discount Tire and they filled up my tires because I did have the light that my tire pressure was low because it had rained before. But they didn't say anything about my tires. And so I was like, okay, maybe something like a cup or whatever got stuck in between my tires and it was making that sound. because I didn't hear it for the next day or so. But then I think it was like maybe like a day or two before I left, I noticed the sound again. And so I was like getting nervous again. And so I'm looking. When I stopped, I didn't see anything in between my tires. And then it was the day before I left that I heard it again. I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know what this is. But I parked at Natural Grocers, and I could finally, when I left, I saw something hanging down, and I might share a picture here. I don't even know what it like. I took it to Take 5, and they were like, we don't know what this is for. We can take it off or leave it, like replace it, find a part or whatever. I was like, just take it off if it's not protecting anything. I need to get my car serviced anyway, so I'll have my service people look into it. But there was that, and then like right after I returned, I noticed that it looks like a part from my covering, like the tire area is missing. I don't know, but I just feel like the last two times, like something happened with my car right before. And then there was one day leading up to the trip that I got home from work, and I saw, my dog has never done this. I'm gonna show you a picture here. He tore up my blinds on my back door. I don't know what would possess him to do that other than Satan. Like, I pray with my dog. You can make fun of me if you want. I was so mad. Like, and you can tell he was biting. So I'm looking at it. He was biting hard on the blind. You could see like it was making his teeth bleed. Like, that was really frustrating. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to get too mad. I have this mission trip to focus on. Okay, so there's that. So if you're going on a mission trip, just beware. There might be some spiritual warfare leading up to it because we're doing stuff that's counter to what Satan wants us to do. Expectations. So like I said, I had an agenda, but you never really quite know how things are going to go. The team that we had been paired up, we met with like three of the others online. And so we seem to get along great, but that's online, right? It's different in person. And so praise God, like it was 6 of us total. It was a set of 2 sets of a mom and daughter, and then another single lady. And I love those women so much. Like, it was only a 6-day trip, but we bonded so well. And I'm so grateful to God for that. We just made quite the team. And then expectations, like, so there was one day we were supposed to serve on a farm, and I was preparing myself. Like, I was in my backyard, like doing all the weeding, and I like replaced my mulch bed. Like, I was preparing like I'm getting ready for this farm day. We get there to the farm, and it had rained, so it was too muddy. We couldn't do anything but like rake leaves. So that was kind of disappointing. Like, I was expecting more of the physical labor. But as I got back from the trip, I realized that it was so much more about the spiritual edification of the people, because they displayed such faith. Like, those that we encountered, they have such beautiful faith in the Lord, but they are really going through it. I mean, Cuba is a tough country, and I can go into more detail, but there was one lady in particular, she had dermatitis on her hands. So it was like her skin was kind of like purpley, and then she had a cancerous tumor on her left hand, which I could like literally see. And then she had some type of reaction to detergent on the bottom of her feet, so she could barely walk distances. I don't think she could get to church. But her faith, like, she was telling us this stuff, but then she would just be like, but I have peace, I have faith, that the Lord will protect me and provide for me. And then she also ended with the fact that with her pension, she only gets about, like, when you equate it from pesos to US dollars, $4 a month. While we were there, we learned that a dozen eggs cost like $10 US. So I'm like, how on earth are you living? Like, $4 a month. I just, it's tough. Just seeing the living conditions, just seeing how the people, like, you're talking to them and they're so faithful, but you could just see like their spirits are just almost broken. And I really feel like that's what the Lord wanted us to be there for, is to really just pray and encourage them. And that's what they really needed. They didn't need us to get our hands dirty and get all sweaty and messy and stuff, but for people to just love on them, to hug them, to let them know there's people thinking of them. And I think there's even a perception that we had gone to a church, and we had a lunch after with some of them, and one of the ladies said, does the U.S. speak bad about Cuba? And or more so about the Cuban people. And we were like, no, not at all. Maybe the government, but not the people at all. I think there's just so much misinformation, I think, between the two countries as well. But it was just, I just loved being there for the people. And there was one night in particular where one of the ladies from my group came to my room and we were just talking about it. And I could tell it was weighing on her. Because in the beginning of the trip, she was so bubbly and so excited. And then, as we were meeting with more and more people, her energy kind of decreased. And so she was just sad. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's a weight. It really is a weight. And we were talking about the prison of the mind. And I'm more kind of like introspective, like introverted. And so for me, it takes time for me to internally process things. And so I didn't really I kind of get into a mode where I just do, right? Like you tell me where to go and I'll do it and I'll think about it later, like really think about it. And so after that conversation, I happened to read Acts 5, the chapter where Peter and I forget who else, they're in prison and they're freed from the prison. And also I read a chapter, Torture for Christ, where he was talking about how the communist government would try, or not the government, but like the people in the prisons would try to brainwash them into believing like communism is good, Christianity is stupid. Like they would repeat these phrases so that people would kind of like take on that mentality. And so I just felt led to kind of like encourage the people on that. The next day, the prison of the mind. And there was actually a gentleman that stepped up later and he was talking about, he was like, I had just talked to someone recently about the same thing. And like that night before, as I was, after that conversation and being in the Word, I did cry a little bit because I was just like, Lord, like I want to come back all the time. Like, please, not every 8 years. And I just want to serve your people. Like, I really just want to encourage them and to just love on them. And then sometimes it's kind of a bad habit, but I'm kind of like giving God like my ideas of what I want to do. And I need to do a better job of like giving him the space and the time to reveal to me how he wants me to serve. And so that next day after the church service, the worship was so beautiful. We sang that song in Spanish, Yeshua. And after everything, this gentleman came up to me and he had like a prophetic word. Now, here's the thing. I'm not a cessationist, but I'm not super charismatic. So I take everything with a grain of salt. But he told me that, that the Lord spoke to him and that I had a passion and a love for Cuba, which is true. Check. That I would come back many times and that I would be part of a revival in Cuba. Bookmark this video to see if that's true over the next few years. But I would love that. Like I would love to be part of a revival. Something that was pretty neat about the home that we would stay at, there were other people that would come in. Like there was a couple that came in, a part of a ministry called Living Water, where they supply filtered water to different, like more hard to reach areas across the world. And so they had a filter there at the home that we stayed at. And there was a gentleman that came who was actually born and partially raised in Cuba. He left after the revolution at the age of 14. And he, after coming to the Lord and, just forgiving the past, essentially, he now comes back. And I think he's more of like, he was an engineer, but he helps kind of like the agricultural space. So he's trying to help them develop more animal feed. But he had shared that in the last 10 years that 10,000 churches have opened in Cuba, which blew my mind. It was just really neat to, we did see the difficult things, but it's like there were so many glimmers of hope. I learned that there was a Christian in the parliament, like blows my mind. But I think like a few days before that, one of the gentlemen that leads the ministry that we partnered with had said that when he was 8 years old, the teacher called him to the front and asked him, like, is he a Christian or whatever in front of everyone, and then called him an enemy to the state. So it was like at one point, Christians were persecuted, like seriously, to the point where they would lose their lives. They would be imprisoned. They would be called enemies of the state. And now, like, you have people in government, you have churches that are just multiplying. That was just beautiful to see and to hear about. And so
Really quickly, sorry. I neglected to circle back on the conversation that I had with that woman in Cuba 8 years ago. Essentially, I knew that if I were to ever go back to Cuba, that I would bring soap to donate. And so there was a day during this mission trip where we passed out rice and beans to families in need. And I had purchased 200 bars of soap that I also passed out to those families. And so I feel like it sounds a little silly, but it meant a lot to me. So, all right, that's it. Back to the video.
Um, that's basically the gist of my trip. I mean, I think one of the, aside from hearing like the different trials of living in under communist rule, it's kind of funny, but it was the mosquitoes. Like they tore us up. I'm gonna post a picture of my back after this one church service. They were literally biting us through our clothes. Um, we had started inside, but then there's a lot of blackouts in Cuba, and so we had no electricity. The electricity went out. We had to go outside, and I just knew I knew I was about to be eaten alive. And so as the sun was setting, the mosquitoes just feasted. By the time I got back from Cuba, I stopped counting at 50 bites. I got bit a lot, and it was miserable. I'm not gonna lie, that was probably like the most miserable thing about the trip. And then I learned that there's actually an endemic virus going around called Oropuche, and it causes fever and muscle, joint pains, headaches, and everything. I'm now a week out, so I think I'm in the clear, thank God, because like I said, and I had put on loads of bug spray, like multiple layers, sunscreen. Nothing would deter those suckers. But that's basically the gist of my trip. Even leaving, it was hard. We had split ways with the group, and I was holding in the tears. And I'm even like getting a little choked up thinking about it now. When I got to my terminal, there was a family that I guess they had left their family. They were crying, and I was like, "Oh no, I'm gonna shed tears." I held it in until I got to Tampa. That was where my layover was before I got home, and I couldn't help but just let the tears drop because I feel like God is really giving me a heart for Cuba and the Cuban people, and I just hope that He uses me mightily or just in any way and capacity, even in a small scale, to really just love on and pour into those people because they need it so much. So please pray for Cuba. It just kind of feels like a tearing. And I think a part of it is it's a random fun fact. When I was a child, I lived in Puerto Rico. And I just remember I was young. I was like maybe 3. Um, but I remember the day we moved back to the States. It was just a very sad day. And when I leave Cuba, it kind of feels like that. Like it brings up those emotions again. And it just feels like a tearing. Um, so yeah, I was doing a really good job. Like I thought maybe I would cry, but I was doing a really good job until talking about leaving. Um, so I think that's all I had. I did want to share this one Bible verse that um, many of you have heard, of course, with regard to missions, in addition to the Great Commission, but it's Matthew 9:35 through 38. And this is as Jesus is working through different areas. It says, seeing the crowds, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and downcast, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, plead with the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. And so when we were there in Cuba, the gentleman that leads or co-leads the ministry that we partnered with, he wasn't necessarily say like, please bring me your resources, send all the money you have, but he was really just asking for people to come back. That was all they were asking, just come back and tell others to come. And so that's just my prayer that God would place it on the hearts of many in the States to go to Cuba. That gentleman that I mentioned earlier, that's former engineer that was born and raised in Cuba, his heart's desire was for the two to reconcile. So that's kind of become a prayer for me as well, for the U.S. and Cuba to reconcile. Yeah, I hate to end it in tears, but it is what it is. So yeah, thank you for making it through. Sorry for all of the pictures. I just wanted to share just how awesome this trip was and my heart for Cuba. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. I'd love to connect you with the people at Bold Hope if the Lord is tugging on your heart to go. And I sure hope that's the case. But that's all for now. I will see you guys next time. Enjoy your day.